Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm just trying to make sure everything's working. Okay, on my end, I can't see whether I'm muted or not. So let's hope I'm not. There we go. Okay. Um, all right, so this is Dr. Schwarz. I have my camera off because I'm recording this at 6 a.m. outside. So it's dark anyway. You wouldn't be able to see me. However, I'll turn them on for some of the other recordings. All right, so good morning and congratulations on finishing mock exam 2. This is the run through of the answers for that exam, and then I'll see you guys at 1 p.m. for the live Q&A. Sorry, lost my words for a second. Okay, so the first question on here was a farmer is having a problem getting her tomato seeds to germinate. Which strategy has the best chance to help the seeds germinate? So for this one, we can actually go right to the book. The answer is E. And if we go into Campbell in chapter 39, right, we have this table that explains, um, some of the major hormones that we talked about, right, during our other sessions. I'm going to go back for 1 second here. So here, if you remember, the intensity of blue light has more to do with circadian rhythm type activities. Applying auxin has to do with directional growth. So once something's already germinated, right, if you need to grow towards the sun, for example, auxin is at play there. Or if you need your roots to grow down, right, auxin is at play there. Increasing carbon dioxide concentrations wouldn't have anything to do with this. Those would actually play a role in fruit ripening and blocking the ethylene pathway. Dehydrating the seeds also wouldn't work here because of the fact that if you remember, there is another hormone called abscisic acid that's in really high concentrations in seeds, in some seeds anyway. And really, in order to get those to germinate, you have to dilute that hormone in the seed because when it's in high concentration, it inhibits germination. And so you actually need to bombard them with water in order to get them. So that's actually the opposite of what you would do. And so therefore, our gibberellins are the best answer for this one. And like I said, right, you can go back here to look at the things. If you don't already have them, put the hormones in a chart for safekeeping and quick reference and quick studying. So you don't have to like go back to this table with a bunch of stuff in it all the time. And again, the top picture here is really just showing the action spectra, right, for various things. So this has to do with blue light stimulated phototropism, right? So this is blue light plus auxin at play here. But again, right, gibberellins are the right answer, and we can see that down here in our table from the book. Okay, great. Question 2. Which of the following correctly labels the regions of the seedling shown here? So if you remember, hopefully if you're seeing this, maybe you think of the difference between a monocot and a dicot. This would be a dicot because we're seeing the two cotyledons up here. So dicot meaning two cotyledons. So that right there can tell you that one, right, is a cotyledon. So we know A or B has to be the answer. And then you have to remember, okay, well, you know, what is a meristem and what is a hypocotyl, right? So here, a meristem, if you remember, our meristems are going to be, in this case, this is the root meristem, right? They're going to be our regions of rapidly dividing cells that you find either at the very tippy top or at the very bottom. And the hypocotyl, hypo meaning under, right? Think of hypothermia, right? Your temperature is lower, right? It's under what it should be. So you could think of this hypo being right under the cotyledons, right? So that's why it's hypocotyl. It's under the cotyledons. Okay, so if you can just keep your cotyledon and meristem straight, right? You should be able to figure out that hypocaudal. And here's just some diagrams from the book that you can reference in order to go back to this concept if you've forgotten it. Your brains have been squished with so much material, right? It's always good to go back and reference some of these things. Okay, cool. So here, right, which of the following is most likely to result in a clumped species distribution? Okay, so for this one, in A, oyster larvae are carried by ocean currents and can drift and disperse across large distances. With that, remember this is something called broadcast spawning, and that's going to be random, right? In B, the territorial animals, right? They tend to be uniform and not clumping together. Let's see here. So then D similarly, right, is a territorial one. So that would also be clumped. Or sorry, uniform, not clumped. And then seedlings sprout wherever the fruit from a tree end up. That's also random. And so that really leaves us with E, right? We have this caribou that travels in large herds for protection. So you would imagine, right, that if they are traveling in herds, they would be in a clumped distribution. Okay, so I won't overtalk that one. I'll try not to. We'll just move on to the next one. Okay. What do fish and flowering plants have in common? This honestly sounds like the beginning of a joke to me, but I don't have any good punchline for it. Okay, so here, right, we can look at this. So A, both are autotrophic. Well, fish aren't autotrophic, right? They don't make their own food. So we can mark that one off. Both are prokaryotic. That's not true because we know archaea and bacteria are prokaryotic in nature. Both have cell walls. Well, animals do not have cell walls, right? But plants do. Both have a lateral line system, not so much, right? But both do carry out respiration. So this one was just a matter of, eliminating all these things based on the characteristics that you know. If you need to go back and touch up on plant or just respiration in general, right? You can go to chapter 9 in the textbook. Oh, hold on. My dogs have a frog. I'm going to pause. Okay, I'm back. All right, so if you need to brush up on respiration, right, for both animals and plants, then you can go back to chapter 9 in the Campbell book to do so. All right, question 5. This graph shows the change in distribution in mass or of mass for a population of frogs. Speaking of 10 generations. Which conclusion from these data is correct? Okay, so it says the dashed line shows the original generation, F1. Okay, so then if the solid line shows the descendant generation, one thing that we can see, so always look at the graph and make your conclusions before you read the answers. Sometimes that helps. So in the descendant population, we see that the mass has an average of like, I don't know, 7, whereas the parental generation has a mass around 9 grams, right? So they got smaller. Okay, so let's read through the answers. So the average mass of frogs has increased. No, that's the opposite. Variation in mass has increased. Maybe. The population is declining. No, that's not really appropriate, right? Because it's not telling us numbers. We're simply looking at, the frequency of weight. Larger frogs have higher fitness. Again, this doesn't tell us anything about fitness. It doesn't tell us, we would be looking at a survival curve or something like that for this. Mass is not heritable. So this also doesn't tell us whether or not mass is heritable. So the most appropriate one here is that variation has increased, right? And the reason why is because this peak of the original generation is much more narrow than this one, which is more broad. Okay, so then for question 6, survivorship curve shows the percentage of individuals within a population that survive from 1 to 18 years of age. Which species does the population most likely belong to? Okay, well, here we go. Survive from 1 to 18 years of age. So there's a couple of things we can think about here. One, since we know we're looking at something that survives from 1 to 18 years, we know that it's not going to be a bacteria, right? And likely it's also not going to be a hummingbird, okay? Because they don't live 18 years. So here, let's see, and bluefin tuna are the smaller tuna. The albacore are the big ones. So I don't know, maybe, but I doubt it. A redwood tree is going to be much longer lived. So redwoods live hundreds of years. So here you just kind of have to draw back and think about what you remember. But an elk, that's probably most similar to this time span. And so in fact, that is the right answer. So again, this is just a simple, like you don't need to memorize like a survivorship curve of every single critter, right? Or organism. But you do need to just be able to deduce, right? Like, okay, bacteria live, hours, days, right? Not years, and so on and so forth. And so, if you wanted to also tie this into the types, right? We know that mammals tend to have this type 1 curve, or somewhere in between like a 1 and a 2, right? So like down there, we've got the building squirrels. Is that what they're called? I forgot now. But I think that I might have just completely made that up. But then, we have other mammals like humans, right? Which the elk survivorship curve that you're seeing here really is mimicking pretty well. Okay. Okay. So question 7, a new species is discovered that is unicellular and heterotrophic. It has a membrane-bound nucleus and a cell wall. In which group should it be classified? So here we look for our key characteristics. So it has a membrane-bound nucleus and a cell wall. So we know this is going to be eukaryotic. That rules out A and D. And so now it could be either B or C, right? Fungi have a cell wall of chitin, and plants have a cell wall of cellulose. So the first part of this question can give us a hint, right? So it's unicellular and heterotrophic. Well, by definition, plants are autotrophic, right? And there are, in the kingdom Plantae, various things fall under that, but like green algae and things of that nature, some of which are unicellular, but again, they're all autotrophic. So B is the correct answer because they're heterotrophic. And here is, this is from chapter 1 if you need a review of some of those characteristics. Okay, question 8. Which statement is an example of convergent evolution? So if you remember, right, think about what convergent evolution is. This is where two things that are not closely related to one another share similar characteristics due to often environmental pressures. So a species of hawk is evolving so that its eyes are closer together. Well, that only is a hawk species, right? So that's not saying anything about two species that are not closely related. The vertebrate forelimb includes a wide variety of structures and functions. And so that's more of an analogous thing or a homologous thing. Humans and octopuses, right? And again, all vertebrates. So for B, all vertebrates, are relatively closely related. C, humans and octopuses have picture-forming eyes that function similarly. However, the recent common ancestor of the two lacked such an eyeball. This sounds a lot like convergent evolution, right? We've got an octopus, which is a mollusk, and a human, which is a vertebrate, that have very similar eyeballs, but we know not all other things from the most recent common ancestor of those two organisms all have the same sort of eyeballs, right? Okay, so that sounds good. A species of flowering plant and an insect that pollinate have a mutualistic relationship. So these are evolving favor habits, evolving to favor habits, sorry. So this one isn't convergent evolution, it's coevolution. Because they're not forming similar characteristics. For example, a flower will form characteristics that make it look like, like a female backside of a wasp, right? That pollinates it. And then the wasp will form characteristics that basically help it pollinate that flower better or more efficiently. And so they're evolving different traits, right? They're evolving different adaptations in this coevolutionary process that really ends up in them working together better. But that's coevolution, not convergent evolution. And then humans and chimpanzees both have fingernails instead of claws. So this is actually, humans and chimpanzees share a very close common ancestor, and this trait was likely in that common ancestor. So that tells us that E is also not the right answer. So I think C is our best answer here. And if you need to go back to that, right, there's a couple of places in the book that talk about it. So from, 52 is in plants, right? Convergent evolution in plants. So like the euphorbs and some of the other cacti, or cacti. Euphorbs are not cacti, but they look like it. And then convergent evolution of marsupials in chapter 34. So just go back and this is a bluefin tuna for the record, which we saw earlier as an option. Okay, question 9, how do kangaroo rats survive extremely long periods of drought? Okay, so this one, right, this has to do with the ability to concentrate, right? When we think of drought, we think of no water, diluting our urinary system, right? And so really what happens here, the best answer is they produce concentrated urine with kidneys that have a relatively thick medulla and long hoops of Henle. And so this allows them to survive these extremely long periods of drought. And if you need to go back and check this one, it's in chapter 34, and it tells you kind of the breakdown of all of the things that happen within the kangaroo rat to survive during drought. Okay, which of the following are macronutrients essential for plant function? So here we have schnapps. So schnapps is carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur, or calcium, sorry, not carbon. So that CHNOPS is a way to remember the nutrients essential for plant function. And so that's how I always just remember this. Glucose, fructose, and sucrose are sugars, right? And plants produce sugars. Carbon dioxide, water, and soil aren't macronutrients, right? Because these are compounds of them, like, these are molecules as opposed to macronutrients. Nitrogen, manganese, and potassium. Nitrogen, yeah, eh. Potassium, kind of sometimes, but manganese would be more of a micronutrient for them. So I just remember the schnapps, and again, that's CHNOPS. So calcium, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur. Whoa, sorry, I clicked a bunch all at one time. Okay, and then here's the table from the book too. So let's see. Yeah, manganese is not on here. So here's all of the macronutrients. So you could see it's basically um, the schnapps you can make out of it. And then kind of remember magnesium is in there also, and potassium. Okay, question 11. Which phylogenetic tree depicts evolutionary relationships that are different from the other trees? So one thing that I would look for if these, get you all discombobulated, is look for the small groups within these. So like, here's a little group, right? Here's a little group that's sister to something else. So look at these. Now, anytime you can just take scissors and like snip a branch off like this, you can rotate around this axis. So, and if you do that with this group per se, right? If you just rotate this, flip it upside down kind of, you actually get a relationship that looks a lot like this, right? And that's actually the same relationship. Notice that that one is still sister to this little group, just like it is up here. It's also got this other sister group here, and that's all sister to that top one. So A and B are similar. All that happened is that some of these got flipped around the axis. And I would say for the same reason, C is the same as A and B also, and D is as well. But what's different here, right? Because we all have this, the first four all have this small group nested with this sister group. However, if you look at E, that is no longer there. So just to color code them a little bit, right? Basically, those yellow and green relationships stay the same through all, well, in relation to the red line, all remain the same, A, B, C, and D. But A through D. E, however, has a different structure. So here we've got two smaller groups that are sister to one another instead of being nested within another. And then that group is then sister to this yellow lineage, whatever that yellow lineage is. But you could see from the first four that none of those groups are actually sister to the yellow lineage. The yellow lineage is actually an ancestral lineage in all of the other four. So E depicts a different evolutionary relationship than the first four do. If that was confusing or I didn't explain it well, then definitely come to the live FAQ and we can go over it. I'll try to draw it instead of just talk about it. Okay. And then again, this is where in the book you can find the phylogenetic relationships. Chapter 26. Okay, question 12. Which statement about energy flow in ecosystems is correct? Okay, so all energy available at one trophic level is transferred to higher trophic levels. Not all, right? If you think of like a tertiary consumer or something like that, your apex predator, where is that going to go? Herbivores obtain energy from primary producers. That's true. Decomposers feed only on the lowest trophic level in the food pyramid. That's not true because decomposers feed on anything that dies, right? So that can be at any, I mean, you see your vultures, which are kind of a decomposer, right? Vultures on the side of the road eating deer, and things like that. So, and fungi eat, um, they'll decompose plants and things. So, not necessarily true. Primary consumers obtain energy through photosynthesis. No, primary producers would. Primary consumers eat the primary producers. The lowest trophic level of a food pyramid stores the least amount of energy. That's false because the lowest trophic level of the food pyramid is actually what produces all the energy, and then it's lost 10% at each level, right? As you go up each level. Okay, so in fact, B is the correct answer here. Okay, and if you needed to go back and check this, right, chapter 55 is where you can find that information. Okay, question 13. Dwarf mistletoes are plants that grow into the branches of hemlock trees and absorb nutrients for their growth. This penetration causes weakening of the host tree. What type of species interaction is this? So if you remember, right, let's see. So mutualism and commensalism are similar in the fact that commensalism is where one benefits, but the other is not affected at all. Um, Mutualism is where they both benefit, right? So A and D are out on this one because only the mistletoe is um, benefiting from this, right? The other tree is weakening. Okay, so here, because of the fact that the mistletoe is actually weakening the host tree, this would actually be an example of parasitism. It wouldn't be competition because these things aren't competing for the same um, resource. That's more where you have individual trees, right? Or different species of trees in the same area that are competing for light, right? Or things like that, or competing for nutrients in the soil. This is where one is actively stealing nutrients from another, um, like in close physical contact, right? So, and then predation doesn't really fit here because this is where, you don't have something hunting the other, for lack of a better word right there, but that's typically what you think of when you think of predation, right? You think of things, organisms that are separate, but one eats the other. um, and in this case, right, we have something growing into another one that's just slowly stealing nutrients as opposed to just eating it, right? So that's why parasitism is the right answer here. Okay, question 14. In cold environments, such as the Antarctic, the large and featherless webbed feet of penguins could potentially provide a large amount of surface area for heat loss, which is costly for an endothermic animal. Which of the following is an adaptation that prevents heat loss through the surface of a penguin's feet? Okay, so here, let's look at the right answer and work backwards. So anything, right, where you have things in close proximity to one another would help with this. So let's see here. So blood vessels in a penguin's legs are arranged closely in parallel so that arterial blood is cooled as it flows past cold venous blood towards the extremities. So this one is, let me see if we've got it. So this one, right, if you go to chapter 40, and you can actually read up on this, and you can see the other animals that also have a similar arrangement. Because, right, this is what allows them to kind of trap heat, right? Um, and not lose it to the environment. Okay. Question 15. So, which statement about introduced species is correct? Some introduced species can alter the habitat. Yes. All introduced species are also invasive species. No, not necessarily. Let's see. One of the major characteristics of introduced species is overexploitation. That would be overexploitation would be a characteristic of an invasive species, but not all introduced species will actually reach that level where they overexploit the environment. Invasive species often reproduce slower than the native species. No, that's the opposite. They normally reproduce faster, like with zebra mussels, right, which I've talked about before. Um, they reproduce faster than all of our native mussels and clams and things like that, and they just take over environments. And then E, all introduced species are beneficial to the native species, which we know for a fact is not true. There are some that are beneficial, but definitely not all. So A is our correct answer here. Yes. So this is just a simple graphic of invasion stages. But you can also go back to the ecology section of the Campbell textbook to look at it. Okay, and to review it. So question 16, which of the following is a major revelation of the theory of evolution by natural selection proposed by Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace? So they suggested that life could arise from non-living matter. That was not part of natural selection. They recognized the importance of variation within populations in the evolution of species. Okay, I'll buy that. They showed the acquired characteristics could be passed from parent to offspring. That was more of a Lamarckian theory. That was where, if the parent giraffe constantly ate leaves from high up in a tree and its neck stretched throughout its lifetime, then that stretched neck would be inherited by their offspring, which we know is not how it works, right? It's all in the genes. Okay, they determined the mechanism by which adaptive traits are inherited. I don't know about that one. Okay, they were first to propose that species could change over time. So, here the best answer is E, because while they did recognize the importance of variation within populations, really they were saying, species could change over time. And so if you want to see more about exactly how this played out as a hypothesis, you can go back to chapter 22.1 to check it out. Chapter 17, question 17. Dissection of a duck heart reveals variation in muscle thickness among the heart chambers. Which statement best explains a reason for this morphology? And so E is the correct answer here. If you need to find more information on this one, go to chapter 42 and you can see a breakdown of why that would be. Okay, question 18. The diagram below shows a cross section of a plant stem. What is the labeled structure and one of its functions? Okay, so here what we have is, if you can remember secondary growth, right? And right here, we're just looking at primary. We're not looking necessarily, but having an idea of how secondary growth works would help here because of the fact that if you remember, xylem is always on the inside and phloem is on the outside. And when we have that secondary growth, it's that phloem, the old phloem, that actually turns into things like bark and cork that you find on the outside of a tree, right? Whereas the xylem is on the inside, and that's what carries water. So here, it's just really about remembering, that xylem is on the inside, phloem's on the outside when you're thinking about a stem. Um, and, right, so for that, we know this is going to be A or D, right? So then it comes down to what is xylem's function, right? Is it gas exchange or is it transport of water? Well, it's transport of water, right? Gas exchange is stomata in the leaves, generally speaking. We also have some structures in things that have undergone secondary growth, like lenticels and things like that, that are helpful in gas exchange, but those aren't tied to the xylem. So for that, D is our right answer, right? So xylem's always on the inside, phloem's always on the outside. And then xylem is important in the transfer of water. Okay. And so you can go back to Campbell. I can't remember the exact chapter, but this 23, I think this might be the Raven book. I'm not sure. Okay. So also, these are from Campbell. Here we go. So chapter 35, that's what I was thinking of. And you can see the vascular bundles here, right? With the xylem on the inside, phloem on the outside. All right, question 19. Many amphibians are able to breathe with their skin as well as with their lungs. Consider an amphibian whose body is submerged underwater and whose mouth and nares are above water so that it can inhale and exhale air. How will the rate of oxygen diffusion across the submerged skin compared to the rate of oxygen diffusion across the lungs? Okay, so with this one, you have to think about you have to think of your diffusion principles, right? So the amount of oxygen, the difference in the amount of oxygen, excuse me, in one environment versus the other. So oxygen diffusion across the lungs will be faster because the amount of oxygen in water is much lower than in air. And so therefore, right, breathing in the air will actually be much faster. And then you've got some question options that overcomplicate things. So always watch for that. If things are too complicated and you can't and you can't make sense of them, then that means that, it's probably not the right answer. All right, and if you need to brush up on this, right, you can go to chapter 42. Question 20. Mycorrhizal fungi are available for purchase by farmers and home gardeners. These fungi are predicted to have a major impact on how we grow our food in the coming decades. How do these fungi benefit growers? Okay, if you remember, I had posted that TED Talk of Suzanne Simard, who's she's a forest ecologist, a forest scientist, and it really shows how mycorrhizae is beneficial. But so the big is A, they interact with plant roots to provide water and nutrients to the plant. The mycorrhizal network is really what you're seeing down here. So you've got the plant roots, right? But then a lot of this is actually mycorrhizal fungi. And so what they do is they basically add surface area to the roots and allow for more nutrients and water to be absorbed And so none of the other options are correct here. Question 21, a dog has an adult tapeworm or adult tapeworms attached to the lining of its small intestine. What happens to tapeworm eggs when they are released into the small intestine? So you just have to really know what happens, right? So in the life cycle of a tapeworm. So in this instance, right, they move through the intestine and then are expelled through the anus along with feces. And this is how a lot of things get transmitted, right? People not washing their hands and then touching like their eyes and mouth, or people not touching their hands, touching some surface, and then somebody else comes along and touches that surface and touches their eyeball or their mouth without washing their hands, right? And so again, this is just about knowing the life cycle of a parasite like this. And so the CDC has a great diagram of it. Question 22. So male birds of paradise, these are my favorite. If you have never watched videos of the birds of paradise, just Google it and like find some videos on YouTube. The Cornell Lab of Ornithology has really great ones. So look for those when you YouTube it. But they're so fun to watch. Anyway, so they have feathers that are brightly colored and highly visible, while females of the same species have duller coloration. What statement best describes the difference? So the female birds prefer to mate with males that have bright feathers. Okay, that sounds plausible. Male and female birds live in different habitats. Well, that wouldn't make sense, right? Because they need to mate with one another. So, you know, from this, we know that we're dealing with sexual selection of some sort. Male birds with bright feathers produce more sperm. You know, we don't know if that's true. Birds with bright feathers live longer than birds with dull feathers. We also don't know if that's true, and that's probably not true, right? Because they stick out like a sore thumb, and so predators can see them much easier. Male birds prefer to mate with females that have dull feathers. Okay, so A is our best option here, right? So this is all about female mate choice. And so the female birds, you know, use those colors and those displays as a symbol of health. And that's how they choose their mate. So if you want some more information about this, right, you can go to a couple of different places in the Campbell textbook. One of which is in chapter 23 and another is in chapter 51. Okay, question 23. How does the anatomy of birds allow them to ventilate their lungs in a unidirectional manner? Okay, so here from chapter 42, we can see that well, we could see the airflow, right, through the respiratory system of a bird. And from these options that we see for the question, inhaled air travels to the posterior thoracic cavity and then travels anteriorly through the lungs. And so just from this diagram, we can actually see that that's the correct answer here. Oh, sorry. So if you need to review this, go check out chapter 42 in the Campbell book. Okay, chapter 20, nope, question 24. One unripe peach is placed in a bag with a banana. Oh, this is a fruit ripening question. You should be thinking of ethylene right away. Okay, a second unripe peach is placed in a bag on its own. The peach in the bag with the banana ripens much faster. What compound is the banana releasing that speeds ripening? It's ethylene. And so nitric oxide, not so much. We didn't really talk about that in relation to plants. Oxygen isn't what helps them ripen. This is ethylene is a specific hormone involved in ripening. Auxin again has to do with growth, right, in directional growth. And then carbon dioxide can actually block the ethylene pathway. So it's ethylene. And if you need to review this, it's in chapter 29 of the Campbell book. But yeah, and since it's a gaseous hormone, right, which it says down here in the table, that's why, right? It'll ripen fruits next to it. Okay, marine fishes ingest salt water. How do marine fishes osmoregulate? Okay, so they regulate by the kidneys excreting concentrated urine. Excess sodium and chloride ions are actively transported out of the body through gills. So this is somewhat similar, but slightly different to what we saw in the question about, oh my gosh, the critter, the kangaroo rat. Sorry, I totally blanked on that word, that we saw a couple questions back. So if you need to review how this happens, right, or why this happens, go to chapter 44 for review. Ooh, some phytoplankton. I love phytoplankton, it's my favorite. Okay, question 26. Some phytoplankton undergo either asexual or sexual reproduction at different stages of their life cycle. Which statement best explains why more individuals reproduce sexually when environmental conditions are poor? Okay, so you got to think about what the benefit is of sexual reproduction versus asexual reproduction. So, why do more individuals reproduce sexually when conditions are poor? Oftentimes, and again, for questions that you can, right, think of the concept before you look at the answers. So, here, right, the name of the game in evolution is passing your gametes on, right? Or passing your, not your gametes, but your offspring, right? Passing on your genes. In order to do that, though, um, you know, it's expensive. Sexual reproduction is expensive. So those organisms that can reproduce asexually will do that most of the time until there is some signal that you know, they may not live much longer, right? Such as when environmental conditions are poor. If environmental conditions are poor, all of a sudden you switch to sexual reproduction because even though it takes more energy, then at least you will pass your gametes or your, I keep saying gametes just because egg and sperm sexual reproduction, but because that's what will help pass your genetics on, right? And recombination. So that way it will maintain or add genetic diversity into the population. Because remember, asexual reproduction doesn't add diversity by much, right? It's a very slow adage of diversity using asexual reproduction. So let's look at our options. So sexual reproduction increases genetic diversity. Thus, some offspring have a better chance of survival when conditions are poor. Okay. Sexual reproduction requires fewer resources. No. C, asexual reproduction increases genetic diversity. No. D, sexual reproduction decreases genetic diversity. No. Asexual reproduction increases offspring size. No, so A is our answer here, right? And all because of what I had just talked about beforehand. And if you need to go back to this, it's chapter 28. Okay. But I think also just to mention one other thing, don't get caught up, right, with a question like this thinking like, oh my gosh, I don't know the phytoplankton life cycles, right? Like it doesn't even matter for this. All you just have to know is like the pros and cons of sexual reproduction versus asexual reproduction. And if you know that, then you know this question. Okay. And I just wanted to mention that since we've got like a very specific life cycle here, which you don't necessarily have to memorize that life cycle. You just have to understand why you might want to switch between asexual and sexual reproduction. Okay, question 27. A breeder wants to create a variety of conifer tree that does not shed a lot of needles. Which attribute should be selected for? Okay, So let's see here. So trees with a thinner cuticle that protects the leaves. Eh, I don't think so. And I'll explain why in a second. So trees that produce a large quantity of sap to halt water transport. Eh, maybe. Trees that utilize more carbon dioxide. Sorry, I skip around sometimes. Trees with fewer stomata in their leaves. Okay, so that does not shed needles. Okay, so if we don't want, and then C doesn't really make sense, right? Trees that produce more aromatic compounds so that people will be reminded to water them. So C you could knock out. Um, D, so here you have to think about, okay, so if we were to select for A, trees with thinner cuticle that protects the leaves, then those would dry out much quicker and fall off more frequently. So that would do the exact opposite from what we wanted to do. B, trees that produce a large quantity of sap to halt transport wouldn't really have much to do with this, actually. Just like E and C don't really have much to do with this. I mean, if you have trees that produce or utilize more carbon dioxide, like in E, you're just going to, sometimes you might photosynthesize at a faster rate, but not always. There's a saturation thing going on there where, you know, if you take in more CO2 at some point, you're not going to, you know, photosynthesize any faster. So in that regard, right, we're not really talking about pine needles falling off. It's just photosynthetic rates that might change with that, or production, I guess, photosynthetic output. But D, if they have fewer stomata in their leaves, right, there will be less opportunity for them to lose moisture, less opportunity for them to dry out, therefore less opportunity for them to fall off. And so that's kind of the line of reasoning for this one. Oh, sorry. And if you want to go back to it, I think chapter 35 in Campbell is it. I think, again, this chapter 18 is from the Raven book. Okay. Question 28. So licorice ferns, I love those, along the trunks of a big leaf maple tree. So the ferns provide nutrients for their host. What term best describes this relationship? So if the fern is providing nutrients to that tree that you see, then we'll start thinking about, okay, this is not parasitism, right? And it's not predation because there's something helpful happening, right? So we can rule out, and it's not competition either, because they're not really competing for the same source of, you know, light or nutrients from the soil, like we've said before with the mistletoe question. So that really knocks out B, C, and E. So then we're left with A or D. So the question then becomes, the ferns provide nutrients to their host, okay? So then we would start thinking of mutualism for this, right? A commensalism would be more along the lines if one was benefiting and the other nothing was happening to. But since we see that the fern provides nutrients to the host, that means the host is getting something out of it, right? And so, you know, we're likely to see that, you know, the fern growing there gives it some structure, right, to grow on that's up above that helps it from herbivory or something like that, right? So both of these organisms are benefiting, and so that's why we call it a mutualism. Okay, question 29. A botanist wants to breed a new variety of daisy with orange flowers. She crosses a yellow variety with a red variety. She knows that the daisy with yellow petals contain a dominant yellow petal allele and a recessive white petal allele. In which scenario is it possible to obtain an orange flower? Okay, so here we've got to think about, we've got a yellow variety, right? And we've got a red variety. But you know, based on Mendelian genetics, that you will get as offspring some combination of either yellow or red, right? It takes a certain phenomena that will lead to a mixture of the two, right? So the yellow plus red, in order to get some variation of those colors, you know, in the middle, such as an orange, right? We're looking at incomplete dominance. So that's the first thing you should think when you read this question is like, oh, wait, you want orange flowers, but you're mixing yellow and red flowers. Okay, incomplete dominance, right? Because orange is the intermediate color between yellow and red. Okay, so then we're looking at, it looks like A and B. So red petals have incomplete dominance to yellow petals and are dominant to white petals. Red petals have incomplete dominance to white petals and are recessive to yellow petals. Okay, so here, right, we want to look at, so the yellow petals contain a dominant yellow and a recessive white. Okay, so here all we're doing is talking about red petals have incomplete dominance to yellow. Yes, that's true. That's how we get orange in the first place, right? So, and then incomplete dominance to yellow petals and are dominant to white petals. Right. So here you're just, this is just a hierarchical kind of reasoning thing, right? So we know that red petals have incomplete dominance. Okay, two yellow petals, right? Because that's going to be your other variety, and are dominant to white petals. And those are dominant to white petals because the white petals are recessive. Okay, if you need to go back to this, right, chapter 14 is where the incomplete dominance and the snapdragon, where you mix red and white and you get pink ones, right, pink flowers for the heterozygotes. So again, incomplete dominance is just where your heterozygotes are like literally an intermediate color between the two that you're breeding together. Okay, question 30. A farmer planted canola seeds on the same day in the same field every year for the past 4 years. The farmer observed that the seeds took a week longer to germinate this year. Which of the following is not a plausible explanation for why it took longer for the seeds to germinate this year? Okay, so the seeds used this year were older. Okay, there are more nutrients in the soil this year. I'm not sure, you would think maybe that would lead to germination faster. It was colder this year. That could be. It rained less this year. That also could be, right? Think of washing out that abscisic acid or undiluting it, or no, diluting it. Sorry. It was cloudier this year. Okay, so I would say B. Okay. And that's because all of the other things are plausible, right? Do we know which one it is? No, but it's just asking which one is not plausible. If there are more nutrients in the soil this year, you would think that you would probably get faster germination, right? Maybe. But on the other hand, if all of these other conditions, you know, were true, it wouldn't even matter the amount of nutrients in the soil, right? Because we know seed germination has to do with the plant hormones reactions to things like red light and far red light, water, right? So we can dilute that abscisic acid that's in the seeds and kind of kick off the gibberellin mode of action, right, to get them to germinate. And so the nutrients in the soil is the one that is not plausible, but everything else could have to do with that. And, you can go back to the Campbell book, and I don't have the exact chapter on me right now. Chapter 38, sorry. So chapter 38 for this one in the Campbell book. Okay. Question 31. How does water get to the leaves of a tall tree? Very carefully. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, so if you remember, right, first think xylem, okay? And you've got to think of the mechanism of the pull, right? The transpiration pull, because the stomata open, right? And there's a difference between the inside of the leaf and the air outside, so that as water leaves the stomata, it also pulls up water, right? All the way down from the root. And so we can rule out some things here. So we know that it's not pushed up from the roots to the leaves via metabolically active pump in root cells. That's not a thing. Now, to get in some of the nutrients that might be, we really talked more about this in the transport of phloem, right? Because in some of those cases, they do need active transport, but not necessarily a metabolically active transport. Okay, so I'll skip down to C. It's not actively transported from cell to cell. D, it enters the leaves through the open stomata. No, because remember, it leaves the leaves through open stomata. It is transported through phloem, and we know phloem is not responsible for water transport. It is responsible for sugars and photosynthetic products and things like that that go from the leaves to the rest of the plant. Okay. And if you need to brush up on this, it's chapter 36 in the Campbell book. All right, question 32. We're more than halfway done. Okay, nutrients are cycled between the abiotic and biotic components of an ecosystem. Which organisms can take up and release carbon in an ecosystem? So, fungi. No, okay. I took a guess. Okay, so which organisms can both take up and release carbon into an ecosystem? So fungi, remember that insects, right, or invertebrates, both are in the same boat here, actually. So they can take up oxygen, right, and release carbon. And if that's just thinking about respiration, right? Fungi, yeah, since fungi are heterotrophs, they have to break things down in order to get carbon, much like us, right? That's why we eat. That's why insects, invertebrates, and fungi eat. And fungi don't eat in the sense that we eat, or like insects eat, but fungi digest things in the environment to break it down, and then they take it up. So very similar. So they're heterotrophs, right? So A, B, and C are heterotrophs, whereas D, plants, are autotrophs. And by definition, right, an autotroph is both taking up carbon in the form of CO2 and releasing carbon in the form of sugars, right? And so that's why D is the right answer. Okay, so here's the carbon cycle if you need a refresher on that. Question 33. Tuna are apex predators that are currently overfished by humans. Which statement correctly describes a consequence of this human activity for the abundance of organisms in the food chain shown here? Okay, so if the tuna is up here, right, and we take them out of the equation, keep in mind, right, so tuna are eating sardines, sardines are eating zooplankton, zooplankton's eating phytoplankton. If we cross out tuna, right, all of these three should increase. The reasoning there is, well, here's a couple of things. So you would think about all of these increasing. However, the tuna is really the check, right, of the sardine population. So you have to take into account this whole ecosystem, this food chain. So if we take tuna out, we could say that all three increase, but really it'll go down in a stepwise fashion. So if tuna are taken out of the scenario, then we have a bunch of sardines, right? Because tuna is not around to eat them and keep that population in check. And so then what's going to happen is that you have all of these sardines now eating zooplankton at higher rates than they did before. And so then zooplankton will decrease. And then you might imagine that then phytoplankton will increase because of that. But then, you could take this down. So that's why A is the right answer. But then you could take this down further, right? And then what if we overfish sardines? Well, then zooplankton will explode, right? And then we'll have a decrease in phytoplankton. So you just think of this in a stepwise fashion, and it'll work out. Okay. So question 34, if a flowering plant fails to produce gibberellin, what is most likely to happen? Okay. So if you remember, let me see. And in the book, so in chapter 39, and in the book, there is a picture of the gibberellin Arabidopsis, right? Because gibberellin, they're responsible for a lot of things, but stem elongation is one of them. So there was the spindly rice that we talked about with gibberellins in chapter 39, where the rice plants would just fall over because they were so skinny. And then there are also those Arabidopsis mutants that were in chapter 39 that you want to go back and look at, that were really short, right? And so just go back and review that if you don't have a firm grasp on it. Okay, question 35. Which of the following is not a biological characteristic of desert organisms? Okay, first think about what's different in a desert, right? So A, no regular reproductive cycle. A biological characteristic. Seeds germinate immediately, fewer stoma, specialized kidney, more succulents. Okay, so no regular reproductive cycle is the one that's not it doesn't matter. The desert environment doesn't really matter for reproductive cycles, but definitely all of these other things, right? Think of succulent plants that are adapted to withhold a lot of water. So they're really great at storing water for long periods of time. That's why cactus are so, like, their stems, right, are so thick. Fewer stoma, right, which means fewer opportunities to lose water. A specialized kidney, we saw that in the kangaroo rat a few questions ago. Seeds germinate immediately after flowering and fruiting, right? So that way they don't stick around in the hot desert, basically. They don't have any, in the desert, they don't have a lot of competition for light, right? So that red light will help them germinate quickly. And they don't have a lot of stores, right? They can't really store a lot of water to let them hang around for germination. So that's why A is the right answer for this one. Okay, question 36. Which of the following is not evidence that higher plants are derived from green algae? Hmm. Okay, so green algae, here we go. Okay, so this picture has nothing to do with this. Well, it does because it's right here. But which is not evidence. So some green algae have multicellular sporophyte and gametophyte phases, so that is true. Like think of the charophytes. Both plants and algae have cellulose in their cell walls. That is also true. Both plants and algae have similar photosynthetic and accessory pigments. True, right? Chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, and a few others. Both plants and algae synthesize starch as a main store product. True. Okay. So E, green algae and higher plants have the same amount of DNA per cell. Okay, so from chapter 21, you can see here that we've got, let's see here. So Arabidopsis is a plant, and we don't see it. Floating bladderwort might be the closest thing that we have here. So their number of genes is not that much different. And a lot of things are within the same region. So that would be one that's just like, it seems like an oddball answer, right? Compared to the other four. And so that's why I would kind of red flag that one right away, and then read your other options closely to see, if in fact it is the wrong one. Okay, question 37. The statements below are about various pollination strategies in plants. Which one could be the most disadvantageous for evolution of new species? So let's see here. The stigma can recognize the origin of pollen grains and does not accept those from the same flowers. Okay, that could be advantageous, right? If you're thinking about genetic recombination. The stigma never emerges from the corolla and only accepts pollen grains from the same flower. Okay, that could be disadvantageous, but let's see what our other options are. The corolla forms a long tube and only allowing some specialized pollinators which carry pollen grains from the same species to enter. That would be advantageous, you would think. The stamens and pistil mature at different times. Okay, that could be advantageous to avoid inbreeding. The stamens and pistil are located in different flowers. So that could also promote outbreeding. So I would say B would be the most disadvantageous because this only allows self-pollination, which means no genetic recombination, right? Only essentially asexual reproduction, kind of. Their genetic diversity would be along the same lines as though they were asexually reproducing anyway. Okay. If you need more on this, go to chapter 38 in the Campbell book. A lot of these options on here were actually talked about in the book, and you see some of these figures, right? Which are adaptations that prevent self-fertilization. So anything that is locking in self-fertilization only, like B, would be disadvantageous. Okay, question 38. When the temperature is high and the amount of dissolved oxygen is higher than that of CO2 in the chloroplasts, in which of the following plants does growth not slow down? Okay, the temperature is high and the amount of dissolved oxygen is higher than that of CO2. Okay, so with this one, sugarcane is a C4 grass, basically. And so this is just all about understanding that if you've got that higher concentration of oxygen in the chloroplasts, um, they actually have, this PEP carboxylase, because it can be used as an oxygenase, or a carboxylase. And so you just have to go back and make a chart maybe of like CAM, C3, and C4 photosynthetic mechanisms. And that would be helpful, right, to keep all of these straight. So out of all of these plants, sugarcane is a C4 example, whereas everything else on here is actually a C3. Okay, question 39. Which of the following cannot be referred to as a blue light response in higher plants and fungi? Okay, so in this one, phototropism is a blue light response. Okay, so that's not our correct answer, because that is actually a blue light response. Chloroplast rearrangements are also a blue light response. So A and D and C, stomatal opening, is a blue light response as well. Flavonoid synthesis and carotenoid synthesis are going to be our best guesses. Carotenoid biosynthesis and neurospora. I'm thinking on this one for a second. So the carotenoid biosynthesis and neurospora, I guess, is a blue light response, because it's carotenoids are part of like the light harvesting complex for photosynthesis. I guess flavonoids are not part of that whole chain. So definitely A, C, and D are not the right answer, because they all have to do with blue light responses. Those are, if you go back to the book in chapter 39, those are in our list of like blue light responses. And I'm sure carotenoid biosynthesis is in there somewhere. I just don't have it right in front of me right now, but maybe in our Q&A session at 1, we can go over that more if you guys have questions on it. Okay, question 40. Only a few more left. All right, in the figure, changes in water potential in the leaves of a plant over a period of time are shown. Which of the following is true according to this situation? So what we want, okay, so the leaf water potential, okay, is here in the time and days. So around 2, the water potential, day 2 anyway, the water potential is the highest, and day 6, it's the lowest. Okay, so okay, so here, when you have a low water potential, you will see wilting. Okay, so at day 6, we'll see wilting. Okay, so I won't read through all the answers just because they're long. The ABA content in stomata resistance increased between the 2nd and 6th days. The process was reversed between the 6th and the 8th. Okay, so the ABA content in stomata resistance increased between the 2nd and 6th day. So if that's happening, right, stomata resistance will basically lead to more water loss. And so then after day 6, it kind of recovers from that. I'm reading some of the other options here. So D is the correct answer for this. You may want to go back to chapter 39 to just review this. And again, we can also talk about it more at 1 o'clock. All right, question 41. Which of the following is not true for the auxin transport in plants? Okay, IAA, if you remember, IAA is an auxin. It's one of many auxins, but it tends to be talked about as interchangeably with auxin. Okay, so IAA usually does not take place in the sieve tubes and xylem. IAA transport usually occurs in parenchymatic cells adjacent to vascular bundles. Auxin moves rather slowly within the plant. IAA moves mainly from the apex to the base. Auxin transport does not require energy. So it does actually require energy. And so if you go back to chapter 39, oh, excuse me, I have hiccups. Okay. If you go back to chapter 39, right, this is where, this is that colored image of where auxin actually flows. But it does require energy. So everything else here is true. And remember, don't let that IAA and auxin like mess you up, right? They're just in your brain, think of them interchangeably, and don't, you know, don't let your mind wander to like, oh, well, 2 of them say auxin and 3 say IAA. Like what, don't let your brain get caught up on that. It's just a little technicality, and they may be doing it to confuse you on purpose, which is mean. Okay, so question 42. Light is perceived by all living organisms in one way or another. The pigment which is chosen for this process of photoreception are carotenoids. Which of the following properties make carotenoids the right pigment for this function? So this also ties back into that blue light question that we had, right? And so since the carotenoids, and so that's why they're part of that light harvesting complex, but this one kind of puts it into perspective a little bit better for me. So because the carotenoids are a process of photoperception, right, then that has to do with blue light because you need those carotenoids to be able to perceive that blue light and trigger the blue light responses. So that would make sense as to why that one was also relevant in that blue light response question that we just saw like a couple of questions ago. Okay, cool. But to get to this one, right, which of the following properties make carotenoids the right pigment for this function? Okay, so their ability to absorb most of the visible light and ultraviolet light, their high capacity to store and transfer light as chemical energy. B, I'm thinking about because they do transfer really well, but it's more through vibrational energy. So we'll see if it's still relevant here. As saturated organic compounds, their capability to preserve themselves against environmental factors such as high energy currents. That sounds too complicated, I don't think. D, their high affinity for proteins, which have a role in perception. E, the efficiency of long structures of alternating double bonds in their structure to initiate light-sensitive stereoisomerism. Isomerism. That was a tricky word so early in the morning. All right, so here, E is the right answer because of their chemical structure. And so B, I got caught up on that just for a second because they are really good at this, but like I said, it's not necessarily through chemical energy, it's through a different mechanism. So E is the right answer here. And if you need to go back to it, it's actually in the Campbell book on page 568. Or you can wiki it, which is what this is from. Okay. Question 43. The changes that take place in climacteric fruits, when they ripen, are mainly due to, think of fruit ripening. Okay, and ethylene synthesis, right? That's whenever you see fruit ripening, even though we have like some of these like gibberellins and abscisic acid and things like that, and auxin even play a role in lots of overlapping roles in plants. If you see anything about fruit ripening, then you know that's going to be ethylene. Now, if you see something about fruit growth, right? Like think back to the grapes. Like if you want grapes to grow bigger, you can spray gibberellic acid on them or gibberellins. But that's not ripening, right? That's just making them grow bigger. So anytime you see ripening for fruit, ethylene, just go for ethylene. Oh, I didn't catch that. That's obviously very blurry, but this is just the hormone table from the Campbell book. Okay. Question 44. The data were obtained relating to the rates of oxygen release and uptake in plants. The plants were placed in the dark for 12 hours, followed by 12 hours in light. The temperature was constant throughout the experiment. The results are shown in the graph. Okay, which of the following is the most accurate estimate of the total volume of oxygen used by the plants for respiration during the 24 hours of the experiment? Okay. The oxygen taken up. Okay. So here, which of the following is the most accurate estimate of the total volume of oxygen used by the plants for respiration during 24 hours? Okay, so here what you're seeing is in the dark, right? Plant respiration takes up 50 cubic centimeters per hour of oxygen. Okay, so times 12 hours, that's 600 cubic centimeters. And then here, 600 centimeters cubed times 2. So during 24 hours. Okay, so 1200 cubic centimeters is the right answer on that one. I may come back to that one at 1 o'clock if you guys don't bring it up. I might. Okay, question 45. In which aspect does C4 photosynthesis differ from CAM photosynthesis? Okay, again, right, if you have a chart of C3, C4, CAM and the difference, and you can go back to chapter 10 for this, right? The main difference, and you think of, CAM plants as being desert plants. Okay, so because the CAM plants are often desert plants, right? They fix CO2 at night. But C4 operates during the day, or the carbon fixation part does. So everything's kind of going on during the day with C4, but they wait in the CAM plants for that to happen at night. All right, question 46. Which of the following cannot be stated with relation to the shoot apex? Okay, so there's a lot going on here. Okay. A shoot apex with a distinct tunica and corpus is found in gymnosperms. Let's see, there's only one apical cell in vascular non-flowering plants. That is, that one, I guess, is true. Okay, so B, there is more than one apical cell in each cell layer in gymnosperms. There are different apical cells in more than one. Yes, that's definitely true. Okay. An apical cell is a pyramidal shape in non-flowering plants. Okay, so this one is just simply a, you know, ticking off all of the ones that you know are true. So if you go back to, these are from the Raven textbook. In the Campbell one, we didn't really talk about the Tunica corpus organization. So you may want to go back to the Raven book for this, which again, you could see the figure number here. So A through D are true, but then E is not. And you know, you'll just have to go back to that Raven book for that one. Question 47, which of the following cannot be stated for Collincoma? Okay, so if you remember Collincoma, so we have parenchyma, sclerenchyma, and collinchyma. Parenchyma are kind of softer. Collinchyma has long strands like the celery things that get stuck in your teeth that I mentioned during our class. And then sclerenchyma is really hard, like on holly leaves, like those leaves of holly are really hard because they have sclerenchyma. Okay, so it's a living tissue found in developing organs. It is formed in the roots only under the effect of light. Yeah, we didn't really talk about that. Its location in petioles is peripheral. It is located at the periphery of woody stems. It is located at the periphery of lamina. So in this case, so collinchyma is not in woody stems. So it's a primary growth thing instead of a secondary growth thing. And so this again is from the Raven book. Let's see if but you can also find it, you know, if you look it up in the Campbell book, which is where we originally talked about it. Okay. Oh, go back. Yeah, okay. And this is just the 3 basic types that I had talked about before. Okay, question 48. In C4 plant photosynthesis, let's see here. Which of the following is the correct answer? Yeah, so we know from this diagram that we can see from Campbell chapter 10 that 3PG is not the first product of CO2 fixation. B, 4 carbon acid are formed by PEP because that's over here, right? So it's actually formed by this. Continues at a lower CO2 level than in C3 plants. That's true. And so again, this is one of those where if you've got a chart of C3, C4 versus CAM, right, this would be something that you'd want to have in your chart, like the CO2 levels. Okay, 2 more, guys. All right, question 49. The diagram below shows a cut across a portion of a green, non-woody stem with a vascular bundle. It may be reasonably concluded that, all right, let's see, starch would be found in the cells in area 3. No. Area 2 differentiated from protoderm. Sorry, my dog's playing with a squeaky toy. We only have 2 questions left, so I'm not going to stop her. Okay, C, area 4 was stained red of safranin. Area 5 was interfascicular cambium. So area 4, stained red of safranin. This has got to be a Raven book thing. So C is the right answer. Safranin stains the cell walls of wood. And so it will stain anything that's lignified, which in area 4 here, sorry, area 4 here is a xylem cell, right? We had that question earlier, xylem on the inside, phloem on the outside. So that's why, area 4, that's why C is the right answer, is because that safranin will stain the lignified cell walls, which xylem has. And then the last one, guys, let's see, the diagram below is a longitudinal section of a flowering plant. What is the type of pollination? Okay, so this looks a lot like a fig flower. And so it would probably be insect pollination, maybe. Okay, so we've got a couple of things going on here. One, we have the staminate flower up here, right? So the staminate flower is going to be the male flower, and then we have the pistillate flower here. So it could actually be, so what happens with insects is that they have to crawl down in here, and in the case of figs, which I said look like this, there's a certain wasp that actually pollinate figs, and they crawl down in here and they actually lay their eggs in there. So most figs you eat probably have like wasp eggs in them, but that's fine. And so this is an insect pollination flower. And so you can see this is the chart from, I actually don't know where this chart is from. It looks like a one from Campbell, from the Campbell textbook. But so here, right, the fact that it's inside the flower, you know, the anthers and the stigma, what happens is that the insect crawls down in here. As it does, it grabs this pollen, right? And it may, you know, pollinate some of these basically, but they probably have a self-fertilization mechanism that'll keep them from being self-fertilized. But really where the magic happens, if you will, is that the insect will then crawl out, right, of this, and it'll go into another flower somewhere else, taking like this pollen with it into another flower. And so, yeah, this is a cool mechanism of flowers. Okay, so that's it. That's mock test number 2. And I will see you guys at 1 o'clock. And I hope that made sense and that I can cut this in a way that makes sense. All right, I'll see you guys at 1.